Welcome everyone to this KNOCA event on what is a climate assembly. So for those of you that don't know, KNOCA is a European network for sharing best practice on the design and implementation of climate assemblies. And one of the ways we're doing this is to organize different events where network members can learn about and discuss past and future climate assemblies, or key citizen assembly features of particular interest to the members. So this learning event is intended to be a basic introduction to the key features of a climate assembly for people with little or no prior knowledge, and to discuss the reasons for running a climate assembly and to answer your questions. And just if you're not aware of it by now, there's an interpretation available in Spanish if you click on the globe on the bottom of your screen. So my name is Bjørn Bedsted. I work at the Danish Board of Technology. I'm part of the KNOCA Management Committee and part of the team behind the design of the Danish Climate Assembly. My co-host is also a management committee member, Vergne, who has had a lead role in preparing this event and presentation. So first I'll go through the key features of a climate assembly and some of the reasons for running it. You will hear then from our two guests, Antoine Vergne and Julia Hoffmann, who we have invited to share some of their insights from their work with climate assembly. After that, the three of you will, or the three of us, will try to answer any questions you might have. We all work as practitioners, meaning that it is part of our job to design and implement citizen participation processes. As we go through these presentations, please note down your questions, but maybe just wait and put them in the chat when we get to the Q&A session. By then you'll know if you have them answered yet or not. And then Frederik will help facilitate that session. So what is a climate assembly? A climate assembly is a process that brings together randomly selected everyday people to learn, to deliberate, and to make recommendations for how to deal with climate change. It is typically initiated and commissioned by public authorities, but it can also be so by civil society organizations. In KNOCA, we have so far chosen to focus our attention on national assemblies, but they can also be local and even global. From a practical point of view, this is a typical way of breaking up the key features of a climate assembly, breaking them up in before, during, and after its actual implementation. I will go through most of these features now, but one key takeaway here is that a lot of the work involved in organizing a climate assembly takes place before its practical implementation. This may seem like a trivial point, but it's really important to stress that a lot of time and attention should be given to this phase if the climate assembly is to be successful. A few words about the framing of the task given to citizens in a climate assembly. First of all, it is important to stress that it should be clear and understandable. These are a few examples from climate assemblies around Europe. What they have in common is that the framing is rather broad, although there are nuances. The important thing is that the task should enable and empower citizens to give recommendations that policymakers are likely to find useful. They are more likely to do so if they can feed into ongoing political discussions and negotiations, and or have the opportunity to initiate new ones. So it is an ongoing discussion among researchers and practitioners if it is better to frame the task more broadly or more narrowly. A broad framing gives citizens a better opportunity to set the agenda, but a bigger risk of not delivering sufficiently targeted input to ongoing political discussions and negotiations. What causes the most heated debate is the political commitment to adopt or respond to citizens' recommendations. Some argue that politicians should promise in advance to turn citizens' recommendations into legislation almost straight away. Others argue that this would be an undemocratic thing to do and that politicians should simply promise to take the recommendations into consideration, whatever that means. There are several things that politicians could promise to do in advance, such as debating recommendations with citizens in parliament, consider holding referendums on select recommendations, giving written responses to all recommendations, and so on. This is arguably one of the most difficult features of a climate assembly to deal with, and it is recommendable to spend a lot of time on discussing this with politicians before proceeding with an assembly. A clear and detailed description of the political commitment will increase the citizens' motivation and help align expectations from different societal actors that all have different opinions on how big the promises should be. In practice, this discussion will continue during the implementation, and it is helpful to think in advance about ways in which it can be facilitated. So these are some of the people and governance bodies typically involved in a climate assembly. It's normal to have a steering group, which could include both the commissioners of the assembly, the secretariat, the delivery team, and representatives from different stakeholder organizations. It's also normal to have an advisory board with experts in climate and in citizen participation, and they can help identify expert panels that will inform citizens' deliberations. Also, one can expect a high level of interest from especially researchers and possibly other kinds of observers. A key question is the role of the secretariat and delivery team in charge of the practical organization of the assembly. Some will argue that the organization of a climate assembly should be handled almost exclusively by independent citizen participation professionals that operate at arm's length from the public authority commissioning the assembly to ensure democratic legitimacy. Others will argue in favor of having public officials at the center of the practical organization of the assembly, because they are closer to the political process, which will increase the chances of political impact. What is probably safe to say is that no matter how the governance structure is set up, citizen participation professionals should have a key role. Also, the governance structure should be transparent, and democratic legitimacy should be ensured by sufficient checks and balances that prevent politically biased processes. One final design feature which I would like to mention briefly is the communication strategy. There's no doubt that a good communication strategy will result in more political attention to the process and thus increase the chances of achieving political impact. But let's take a closer look at the practical implementation of a climate assembly starting with citizen recruitment. A climate assembly typically includes 100 or more citizens which are randomly selected and reflect the socio-demographic diversity in their country. Most often, a large number of invitations are sent out, 5, 10, 15,000, sent out to randomly selected addresses. And out of those, maybe 500 or 1,000 will accept the invitation. And out of those that have accepted, you will then choose a sample that match the statistical distribution in your country of age, gender, occupation, education, geographical zone of residencies, and possibly other socio-demographic indicators that you find important. When you have your citizens, it's time to get started. Here are two examples from Denmark and France of how an assembly meeting schedule can be structured. The Danish example is from the first phase of the Danish Climate Assembly. The second phase is ongoing now. But the first phase took place entirely online, just like the Scottish Assembly. That was a combination of weekend plenaries, thematic evening plenaries, and smaller theme group evening meetings. The French Assembly was structured as a series of 7 face-to-face weekend plenaries. But they share the same characteristics, namely a combination of the 3 components, main components, which are learning, deliberation, and decision-making. So the learning is typically structured as presentations by different resource persons, such as scientists and stakeholders, panel debates between those resource persons, and Q&A sessions between the resource persons and the citizens. In Denmark, written information material was also sent to citizens in advance about climate change, challenges in different sectors, an overview of potential solutions under consideration by different societal actors. The learning input from resource persons will typically take place throughout the entire process. And if well structured, a climate assembly will move slowly from top-down curated knowledge input chosen by the organizers towards knowledge input requested by citizens themselves. Deliberation typically takes place in smaller groups of citizens where draft recommendations are produced. And decision-making takes place in, for example, where citizens choose and frame the themes they would like to work with, and when they rank recommendations at the end of the process. And this is just an example of the program of the opening day for the Danish Climate Assembly. I'll not go through that in details, but slides will be available after this presentation. And these themes on the left are examples of the themes that the recommendations from the Danish Citizen Assembly dealt with. And on the right-hand side, one concrete example of a recommendation. Again, in the Danish case, recommendations were structured in this way. First, one or several related observations, that is facts that citizens want to react to. Then a more detailed assessment of those observations, that is, what is their the citizens' assessment of different ways of explaining and reacting to the observations. And finally, what is the recommendation that this observation and assessment prompt them to give? So when structured in this way, policymakers are provided with the rationale and the consideration behind citizens' recommendations. We now come to the final key features. I will not say so much about evaluation, beside the fact that traditionally a lot of evaluation designs for citizen participation processes, such as climate assemblies, have focused too much on the implementation features and too little on the design features and the follow-up and impact. I will not say a whole lot about the political response either, but this is, of course, highly dependent on the political promises defined in the design phase. But we also must acknowledge that many politicians will feel uneasy about making such promises upfront. One exception is Macron, who promised to adopt all the citizens' recommendations, a promise he couldn't keep, of course. But if properly informed and engaged throughout the assembly process, and after having seen the recommendations, politicians might well be more open to respond in different ways to citizens' recommendations. And these are a few concrete examples of political responses in Ireland, France, and Denmark. But let me finish with this list of reasons for running a climate assembly. One is to bring the informed views of the public into climate policy making. Expert and stakeholders already have more or less well-defined roles, but we lack mechanisms for bringing in informed views of lay citizens that are not just opinion polls into climate policy making. And a climate assembly is one way of doing that. Another reason for running a climate assembly is to break the political deadlock on climate action. Climate assemblies can produce new and pragmatic solutions and agenda setting. And they can sometimes provide surprising insights into how everyday citizens prioritize climate actions. Insights that come as a surprise to policymakers. Often, I would say, they show that citizens are willing to do more than politicians feel safe to do themselves. Another reason is to increase the legitimacy of social action on climate change. This could be action taken both by policymakers and other societal actors. Another reason, again, is to reduce the impact of lobbyists and special interest in climate policy. A climate assembly can help bring out in the open the different positions of lobby groups, and it offers a platform on which they can be openly compared and discussed. Another reason is to increase trust in representative democratic institutions. Proponents of deliberative democracy will argue that it is not enough for citizens to vote every 5 or 4 years and then leaving all decisions to those elected in the meantime. So opening up policy-making processes to citizens' input, they will argue, will help build trust in the institutions. Another reason could be to fulfill a commitment to citizen participation on climate action. So a climate assembly is one way of ticking the box and fulfilling demands and expectations for more citizen participation. There are others, of course, but we will not be talking about those today. And then finally, other reasons are to increase the mutual understanding among citizens and to counter polarization, to increase the level of knowledge among citizens, and the level of political engagement and ownership among citizens. But that's enough from me. Now I would like to give the floor to our two guests that we have invited to share some of their insight from their work with the Climate Assemblies. And we better take you first, Antoine, if you have to go pick up your daughter. So first, let us hear from Antoine Vergne, who is the co-director at Mission Publique in France. His work aims at supporting public authorities, civil society organizations, and private companies to design, implement, and evaluate citizen participation. He works at all levels of policymaking, from neighborhood to global negotiations on topics like internet governance, space and space governance, bioethics, and global governance itself. He was involved as organizer of the French Climate Convention, and he's currently deeply involved in the organization of the citizens panels as part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So please, Antoine, I don't know if I should just stop sharing. I should. But is there anything you would like to share?
No. I mean, yes, but not slides.
No problem. Please go ahead.
And thank you, Björn, and hello, everyone. So I said no, but it's only half a joke. I think what you've showed is very complete, and I wouldn't add many things on the process and the key elements. So I don't want to comment on that. I'd like to give an insight on the governance, what you've said about the governance question. For me, a citizens assembly on climate is relevant if you find the right mandate for the group. So, and what it is to find the right mandate, for me, it's to have the good balance between a vision building or direction giving assembly and a set of technical measures. And both may be traps. If you just ask citizens to develop a vision of what they want for climate in 20 years, it's nice, but it's not engaging enough. If you ask them to develop measures or recommendations to change Article 2, subpoint 2 of law number this and that, it's not enough, because in that sense, you put them in the role of expert, which they are not. So it's the real balance act for me to a successful climate assembly is to find that middle way between the two. Allow them to work on values, allow them to work on something visionary or long-term. At the same time, allow them to be deep enough in the topics to make concrete recommendations. And for this, my feeling is that the best way is to have a kind of deliberation or stakeholder assembly before the citizens assembly. So it lays in the governance structure you have for the agenda setting. My feeling is if you are able to build an inclusive governance at the beginning with stakeholder engagement to define together, so that stakeholders together define the exact mandate, then you will be able to gain ownership of the process from them, and you will augment the chance that you have impact at the end and ownership of the results. And my feeling is that this is where we still need to improve the processes of citizens assemblies at the beginning, and then it will make it easier for the output and for the impact and to have a real leverage effect. And this is based on the experience we have had in France, all that I said, but also past experience on such governance processes on how to augment the ownership of the process by the actors, and not only the public authorities, but also civil society and the private sector and other actors. That would be my main remark. So as a piece of advice is a very good design of the pre-citizens assembly and the mandate giving.
Thank you, Antoine. And would you say what you recommend here what was done for the French Climate Assembly?
Absolutely not. This is
okay.
This is why. No, I mean, and I mean, this is, but I mean, as absolutely not. I mean, for the French Assembly, I think it would have been much better indeed to really have that engagement prior to, because in the French Assembly, many discussions had to take place during the process. And it was a very, so you had many layers. You had to, actors had to agree on the level of recommendations, had to agree on the fine granular mandate. It had to settle many things during the process, which was driving energy away from the process itself. That, and also from the French example, the fact that the mandate was both too large and too technical, and that the citizens were pushed to make very technical recommendations very quickly, was a big problem.
Thank you very much, Antoine. I hope you can stick around for a few Q&As, but let's see.
Yes, I can.
All right. So let me pass on to Julia Hoffmann, who is consultant at EFOC in Germany. And Julia's work aims to contribute to social change and the solution of environmental problems, particularly climate change. She is experienced in the management of renewable energy projects and international cooperation, and was involved in the organization of the German Climate Assembly. So please, Julia.
Thank you, Björn, and hello to everyone. I can only confirm what Antoine was saying. First of all, congratulations to you, Björn, for summarizing so well a lot of aspects and detailed aspects of the how to set up a climate assembly in such a short time, and very impressive. So also not much for me to contribute on that side. I would also maybe just pick out one factor that in the German Citizen Assembly was maybe one of the points that could still be improved is about communication of knowledge, of climate knowledge within the assembly. So it's definitely very important to get good advice and substantial and advice from scientists and information that can be transmitted within the assembly to the participants. But the question is, or the thing is, it's not only about information, as we know, it's about how things get communicated and how they are received by the participants. And since we, everyone, all possible citizens of a country or region can participate, so the prior knowledge level is very different. And to some people, science communication is easy to understand, but I assume for most people it's not. And so you really have to put an effort into breaking down information that is delivered from experts to the participants. And talking about climate, it's something that is so complex, it's so diverse, with so many themes that are that have to be dealt with, because it's a complex issue, and we deal with a lot of numbers, not only emissions, but kilowatt hours and whatever numbers of wind farms to be installed and so on. So it's a mental overload for people participating in the assembly. So don't only choose knowledge conveyors that are good in what they do, but also people that can actually communicate and transmit the information in a way that can be understood by the participants. So that's also one of the key factors to success, so that actually people not only have information available, but it actually could go through them, and they could actually do something and actually respond to that knowledge. And for that, I think not only getting the right experts, but also getting the right communicators of knowledge into the assemblies in general. But I think for climate, it's especially hard, because it's, as I said, it's complex and very factful. So it would be something I would recommend to everyone to really prepare for that and get good science communicators on board. And second point, that what we also learned from our assembly in Germany, the Climate Assembly, is that it's good to have an iterative process. So you actually we helped the citizens to in between twice to assess the impact of their possible recommendations to politics by actually calculating, or ask people who are capable of doing that to calculate the carbon emission reduction impact of the measures of the citizens. Then they could have an idea, or are we on a path to 1.5 degrees or rather 2 or even higher? And that actually really helped people a lot to either enforce their recommendations even more, or to actually say, okay, that's fine, maybe we can concentrate on some more recommendations. So actually having an impact measurement within the assembly was very helpful for us. So just wanted to share that from our assembly.
Thank you very much, Julia. And for all the participants, please feel free to write down questions in the chat, and Frederik will pick some out. But just a quick follow-up question, a few follow-up questions from me is, did you also do this in France, Antoine, to make these reviews of citizens' recommendations in terms of the impact on mitigation?
So this was one of the key design aspects of the process. So for the French Assembly, that each proposition had to be measured against the contribution to reduction, which is, in my feeling, so something that is we proposed that because it was an inspiration actually back to our colleagues in Germany and IFOC, as you did one of the oldest, maybe twin process on climate in 2012 or 13, something like that, which was this process of having recommendation and then put them to an assessment in terms of contribution by a climate institute or climate scientists, and then back to the citizens to mirror them what they were doing in terms of reduction. So we said, okay, this is a very good idea. So this is one of the things we proposed to do for France, and it was done very thorough, in a very thorough manner, because it was the main metric. And then we went on we were, my feeling, a bit too far on the side of only that, and not on, so forgetting a bit the side of values and the side of the vision. So it created a kind of another bias in the process and for the citizens to have too much emphasis only on that, and maybe there is a middle way to that, to assess them, but maybe it shouldn't be the only metric.
Well, yeah, I'm ready. One more follow-up question to the both of you. Maybe there's a connection between your point, Antoine, about finding the balance, right? Balance between vision building and concrete and practical measure, and your point, Julia, about how you curate the knowledge input and time. I mean, a climate assembly takes time, but would it be fair to say that, you know, it takes longer time if you wish to empower citizens in making that choice themselves, whether to focus more on vision building or more on concrete measures? Would it also be fair to say that if you only have limited time, you should try to narrow the mandate and ask for something more concrete rather than vision building? Open question to the two of you. Don't know who wants to go first. Julia, maybe?
I can. Well, it depends what's the starting point of your assembly, and actually also who's commissioning it, and what it's the wish behind from that commissioner. But I would say that narrowing down the questions to the citizens is reasonable, because then you can go more into depth of that question. And then nevertheless, I think the why question will always come up if you talk with citizens, so you can't just take it away. So you will even then have to have an open start, or let's say not an open, but a more broader start with some vision context. And then because if you don't do it in the beginning, it will come up during the process. So you should not leave that out. And so that would be, anyway, my pragmatic answer to that. So you have to do it anyway, or you will have to do it anyway during the process.
Yeah, that's my feeling too. That even if you have a narrow focus, it is very, very important that students can connect to the why they want and they propose the thing. So it's yeah, I would definitely do in any case a vision building exercise, and then of course. And that was one of the points, I think, on the broadness of the mandate or topic or range of topics. I think this is what a good pre-process should give. It should make it possible to identify the 3 or 4 key questions in the national policy discussion or political decision that are the blockades for further policy making. Because Björn, you were saying one of the key advantages is to be able to go beyond blockages or beyond blockades in the discussion. And I think if you are able to identify that as stakeholder, then you can narrow down the scope of topics. And then you have something which can be directly or more easy to connect to policy making. But vision is necessary.
So there's no easy way around that. Everything takes time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. Frederik, do we have some questions in the chat?
Yeah, we do. For example, Bernard has a couple of questions. I don't know if Bernard wants to raise them himself, unmute, and perhaps address one of the panelists.
Yeah. Yes. Hello, everybody. There are only three questions. When we speak about climate assembly, we have climate, and we have assembly democracy, and sometimes we add social justice. So it is 3 different directions and requirements, and it's very difficult to have a balance and equilibrium between them. So regarding the question of the lobbies in the first talk, do you take into account the lobbyists who want to go quicker in the climate transition, and how do you tackle this issue? It was an important issue in the French Convention, for example. The second question is the connection between the legitimacy, because it's a totally new things in a constitutional terms, a citizen assembly, and as far as I'm informed, excepting in the Irish case, you have no legal provisions to give some power and recognize power to this kind of assemblies. So how do you see the legitimacy problem? And very often we say, okay, it's not a competition, it is a complement, but what is this kind of complement? And the last question, and I know it's a very difficult question, you have presented the process with the different sessions and the kind of work packages, but have you any ideas about the decision-making process, the rules, and perhaps the kind of check and balance we have? In the theory of deliberative democracy, we have some, but they are very weak. And I know that when you are in the field, it's not so easy to tackle with this question, but you have to go from a diversity to common decisions sometimes, and it's a very difficult issue.
All right, I'm very glad we invited 2 guests who can answer these difficult questions.
And you too, you have the floor too.
So the first one was about how do we deal with those actors that want to push for
yeah, and they can be lobbyists too. Yeah,
they can be lobbyists too. Julia, Antoine, either one of you want to have a go at that? Antoine?
Sorry, I'll go back to my insight on well-designing the stakeholder process. Because it's also a learning from the French Assembly that you had very different interests trying to influence on the process that were partly in, partly out, that had partly hidden agendas, or most of them, it was not clear. So the power struggle, or Bernard, you were talking about the classical representative democracy and the complement, and I think that's the point. The point is, how do you ease the introduction, or the it's like a brick, or we all ease the placing of that brick of democracy into the landscape of democracy and representative democracy, lobbying, and all the power plays and the power structures that we have today. And Bernard, I can also maybe do a comment on that, and your question about legitimacy. I think it's way too soon to understand what exactly it's going to be. Maybe we have to wait 50 to 200 years in order to understand what is happening now.
Right. And Julia, any comments?
I wanted to add on the legitimacy question. So I think as long as the process is good and transparent, and the recommendations are of good quality, so that they actually can be taken seriously, I think the legitimacy comes from that, from the process and the output of the assembly. So as long as there's no formal legitimacy because it's integrated in democratic processes, then as long as that's not the case, I think we as practitioners, we work on very good processes and getting the best results from each assembly, and that brings the legitimacy. That's how I see it. And I didn't really get the third question about the decision making within the assembly. If it's about the decision making among the citizens, for that we have the deliberation, and so and of course in the end, as far as we did it so far, of course there's also at some point you have to stop, and then we do voting, and then there comes in majority voting. But then again, in the German Citizen Assembly, we had most of our recommendations, or the citizens' recommendations, were actually approved or taken upon by 80% or more, and only some had a lower acceptance rate, and just one was not actually voted upon, very narrowly voted against. But even a recommendation that is voted only with 60% approval rate says that there's no consensus within the participants, and that's also a statement.
Yeah, thank you both. Yes, I guess if you dive into the different procedures of different assemblies, you would find different combinations of reaching consensus and voting and ranking at different stages in the process. This would definitely differ. And when you say legitimacy, what I think about is the promise made by politicians about what role the recommendations will take. And I guess exactly legitimacy, that part of the legitimacy question is something that is still negotiated, and will differ, in my opinion, from country to country, from one political context to another. And the lobbyists, they should have a place in the panels as well as everyone else. So they should be represented as resource persons, if that is one of the societal positions. Frederik, more questions?
Yep. First, there's a factual question on whether there's been a climate assembly in Switzerland, if you can answer that. And then there are two questions related to each other. One is, how can you pressure or include politicians if a climate assembly is bottom-up or initiated by civil society organizations, and make them commit to the outcomes? And what can be the role of NGOs to increase the pressure on good results and commitments?
Yeah. Please go ahead, Julia.
Maybe I can answer the last two, because about Switzerland, I honestly don't know. There was the question. Okay, now I'm. Can you give me one more word about the last two questions, Frederick? Sorry.
It was the one, how can, if it's a bottom-up process, how can you make politicians commit, and what role could the NGOs play? Sorry.
I had a long weekend with deliberations, so my mind is a bit slower day after. So the role of politicians, I can again mention how we did that in the Climate Assembly in Germany. So because our process was bottom up, we didn't have in Germany a public or a political mandate for the assembly. It was initiated by civil society organizations and scientists. So how did we do that? We involved politicians in the agenda setting, as was mentioned before. So agenda setting is very important to get people on board and get different views within to the process, and also and especially if it's not a politically, if it has no mandate by politicians, so that's where you can get the parties, political parties involved. That's what we did. We did a survey with them. And we involved them within the process by inviting them to a panel discussion in the middle of the assembly. So we actually asked them, or the citizens could ask them questions, what was interesting to them. So, and then also the results were handed over to the same politicians and many more in the end. So I think it's a good approach to involve them from the start, throughout the process, and in the end, so you can actually get them to commit to the process. And it's always good to invite them to participate in an assembly, because once they see how engaged citizens are and how well informed they become throughout the assembly, and the quality of the questions they have, they actually automatically get hooked up and want to stay involved and be informed. And then usually they also promise to listen to what's coming out of the assembly. And regarding the role of NGOs, when we, in our process, obviously NGOs played a role, but we didn't put that role as part of the process, but as part of the supporting structure. So they helped more when it came to giving political and media attention to the process, because obviously, as well as you want to keep politics out of the assembly, because you want the citizens to be able to discuss and deliberate in their safe space. You don't want NGOs, as was mentioned before with the question from Vergne about lobbyists. So you have to make a safe space for citizens to discuss and deliberate. So we did that only. We invited people from businesses, politics, and NGOs on specific occasions to give input, and that should be well balanced. But otherwise, I would keep them out of the inner circle, and we organized them as part of the supporting structure. So they helped get the assembly more media attention and political attention.
Thank you, Julia. About Switzerland, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a climate assembly there, but anyone please correct me if I'm wrong. And Frederik, maybe one more question, because then we will run out of time.
Yep. There's one last question on whether it's been possible to increase the public awareness of climate assemblies or other types of citizens' assemblies in France, Germany, or Denmark.
Quick comment from Denmark is that I wouldn't say there has been a whole lot of public attention to the Danish Climate Assembly. Maybe because the first phase was during COVID and happened online, but also because of the budget, I would say, set apart for communication, which hasn't been big. I think experiences are very different in France, but Antoine might have left. but in France, I would say the public attention was quite extensive, which probably also stemmed from the fact that Macron promised early on to take on all of their recommendations and translate them into legislation, which of course heightened the political stakes of the assembly. Julia, a few words on the German assembly.
Yeah, definitely a challenge, because when it's not when the assembly does not have a political mandate, that is a bit more difficult to get the attention, and especially if you don't have maybe the time in upfront to make publicity, to get the word out, and it's tricky, it's difficult, and it's one of the major actually success factors how publicly available is the message of the assembly. So get that right from the start. Put money in there, as Björn said. You need the budget for public relations and getting the word out, so that actually also it's important for citizens, so that they know, well, actually people out there know about the process, and I'm not the only one that knows of it, because I'm inside the process. And it's also a motivation factor, obviously, when they know they are part of something big that is discussed in the media. So also, if it has a public mandate, also make sure that the commissioner has the right budget for that available.
I would think it's safe to say that there's a huge potential for increasing public awareness also on the climate issue. Due to the transparency also of the assemblies. I mean, they're streamed online. There's a lot of information material, video recordings of expert presentations, and all of that is probably some of the best education material on climate change you can find, because it brings together knowledge and different political discussions in a sort of neutral, close to neutral platform where it's discussed. Unless there's a very quick last minute question. No. So I think it's time to finish, and thank all of you for participating, especially thanks to you, Julia and Antoine, who had to leave. Frederik, my co-host. There should be a video recording of this event on the website quite soon. I will also put in the chat here a couple of links. One is a link to a report written by our chair, Graham Smith, the KNOCA chair, on key features of climate assemblies, where you can also read more about this. I would encourage you to check out our future events on our website. There are events both initiated by KNOCA Management Committee and by members of the network. So if you do have proposals for events you would like to organize yourselves, please feel free to fill in the form on our website. Also on our website, there's an announcement for knowledge development projects coming here. This is knowledge development projects and mini grants. So we are inviting members of the network to help us create resources and guidance that improves practice and policy making. So if you're interested, please have a quick look. You'll have to be quick because the deadline for applications is November 29. And finally, I would like to encourage you to sign up to KNOCA as members if you're not already members, and please encourage others to do so as well. So thank you everyone for taking out an hour of your time to listen to us. I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much, and bye.